In the autumn of 1892, along the desolate stretches of the Missouri River, a traveling preacher named Reverend Marcus Whitfield stumbled upon a scene so horrific that it would haunt him until his dying day. What he discovered in a seemingly abandoned ferry station would expose one of the most disturbing cases of ritualistic cannibalism and supernatural terror in American history, a family curse so ancient and malevolent that it had been claiming innocent lives for over 3 generations. The Blackthorn brothers had been operating what appeared to be a legitimate river crossing service for nearly 40 years, ferrying travelers across the treacherous waters where the Missouri met the Mississippi. But beneath their facade of frontier hospitality lay a darkness that stretched back to the old country, a hereditary curse that compelled them to feast upon human flesh in accordance with ancient rituals that predated Christianity itself. Before we descend into this tale of hereditary evil and supernatural horror, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's most terrifying mysteries. And please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with fellow seekers of the truth who aren't afraid to peer into the abyss of human darkness. The Missouri Territory in 1892 was still largely untamed wilderness, where the great rivers carved their way through endless forests and prairies that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers had always been a place of power and mystery, revered by the native tribes who spoke in hushed tones of spirits that dwelled beneath the dark waters and demanded tribute from those who dared to cross. It was here, in this liminal space between civilization and wilderness, that the Blackthorn family had established their ferry operation in 1854. The 3 brothers, Cain, Abel, and Seth Blackthorn, had arrived from the remote highlands of Scotland, carrying with them nothing but a few possessions, an ancient ferryboat and a family secret that was darker than the deepest river bottom. The brothers claimed to be simple immigrants seeking a new life in America, but there were those among the local population who whispered that the Blackthorns had fled Scotland not in search of opportunity, but to escape something far more sinister. The few Scottish immigrants who had encountered the family in the old country spoke in hushed tones of ancient bloodlines, hereditary curses, and practices that had been old when the Romans first set foot on British soil. According to these whispered accounts, the Blackthorn family could trace their lineage back to the ancient Picts, the mysterious people who had inhabited Scotland before the arrival of the Celts. The Picts had been known for their fierce warrior culture and their practice of ritual cannibalism, believing that consuming the flesh of their enemies would grant them supernatural strength and the ability to commune with the spirits of the dead. The Blackthorn bloodline had supposedly preserved these ancient practices through centuries of persecution by Christian missionaries and conquering armies. They had retreated deeper and deeper into the Scottish Highlands, maintaining their cannibalistic traditions in secret, while presenting a facade of Christian respectability to the outside world. Cain Blackthorn, the eldest of the 3, was a man of imposing stature, who stood nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to carry a grown man. His hair was black as coal, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, holding a depth that seemed to suggest knowledge of things that mortal men were not meant to know. When he spoke, which was rarely, his voice carried the rolling cadence of the Highland Scots, but underneath lay something else, an accent that seemed older than any known language. Those who had known Cain in Scotland claimed that he possessed abilities that went beyond those of ordinary men. He could navigate treacherous terrain in complete darkness, predict changes in weather with uncanny accuracy, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to read the thoughts and intentions of others. Some whispered that he could communicate with animals, and that wild beasts would obey his commands without question. Abel, the middle brother, was smaller in stature, but possessed of a wiry strength that belied his lean frame. His movements were quick and precise, like those of a predator constantly alert for prey. Unlike his brothers, Abel smiled frequently, but those who looked closely into his pale blue eyes saw nothing but cold calculation and an hunger that seemed to go far deeper than any physical need. Abel had always been the most social of the 3 brothers, the one who interacted most frequently with outsiders and who seemed to take genuine pleasure in the process of luring victims into their trap. He possessed a charm and charisma that made people trust him instinctively, even when their rational minds warned them that something was not quite right about the situation. In Scotland, Abel had been known for his ability to convince people to do things that were against their better judgment. Local folklore spoke of him as a man who could sell ice to an Eskimo or convince a mother to abandon her children. This supernatural persuasiveness had made him invaluable to the family's cannibalistic enterprise, as he was able to identify suitable victims and manipulate them into vulnerable positions. Seth, the youngest, was perhaps the most disturbing of the three. While his brothers maintained at least a facade of normalcy, Seth made no attempt to hide his otherworldly nature. He rarely spoke, communicating instead through a series of gestures and expressions that his brothers seemed to understand perfectly. His skin had an unhealthy pallor that suggested he spent little time in sunlight, and his movements possessed an unnatural fluidity that made observers uncomfortable without quite understanding why. According to the stories told by Scottish immigrants, Seth had been born during a lunar eclipse, which the family's ancient traditions held to be a sign of supernatural favor. From an early age, he had displayed abilities that marked him as different from ordinary children. He could see things that others could not, hear voices that spoke to him from beyond the veil of death, and seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the family's cannibalistic rituals that went far beyond what could be taught. Seth's role within the family structure was that of a spiritual guide and ritual specialist. He was responsible for determining the proper timing for their cannibalistic ceremonies, selecting which parts of their victims' bodies should be consumed for maximum spiritual benefit, and maintaining communication with the supernatural entities that the family believed guided their actions. The Blackthorn ferry operation was strategically located at a narrow point in the river where the current was treacherous and the waters ran deep. The brothers had built a substantial dock on each side of the crossing, along with a large cabin that served as both their residence and a waiting area for travelers. Their ferry boat was an ancient vessel that seemed far older than the brothers themselves, constructed from dark wood that appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it. The boat itself was a source of considerable speculation among those who encountered it. Local Native American tribes claimed that it had been built from wood taken from trees that had been struck by lightning, which their traditions held to be imbued with supernatural power. The vessel's design was unlike anything that contemporary shipbuilders were familiar with, incorporating elements that seemed to draw from multiple ancient maritime traditions. The ferry's most distinctive feature was its figurehead, a carved representation of a creature that appeared to be part human and part beast. The carving was so lifelike that many passengers reported feeling as though its eyes were following them during the crossing, and some claimed to have heard it whisper to them in languages they could not understand. From the beginning, the Blackthorn ferry service had an excellent reputation among travelers. The brothers charged reasonable rates, operated in all weather conditions, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to navigate the dangerous waters safely. Word spread quickly along the frontier trails that the Blackthorn crossing was the most reliable way to traverse this particular stretch of river. The brothers' reputation for reliability was enhanced by their apparent immunity to the various dangers that plagued other river crossings. Pirates and river bandits who terrorized other ferry operations seemed to avoid the Blackthorn crossing entirely, and the brothers never lost a passenger to accidents or natural disasters. This remarkable safety record attracted travelers from great distances, many of whom went out of their way to use the Blackthorn ferry, even when other crossings were available. But there were always whispers. Travelers who used the ferry reported strange experiences, the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, the sound of voices speaking in unknown languages carried on the wind, and most disturbing of all, the feeling that the brothers were studying them with an intensity that went far beyond normal curiosity about their passengers. Many passengers reported experiencing vivid and disturbing dreams during their stay at the ferry crossing. These dreams often involved being pursued by shadowy figures through dark forests, or finding themselves trapped in underground chambers where unspeakable rituals were being performed. The consistency of these dream experiences across different travelers suggested that they might be more than simple products of imagination or suggestion. Local Native American tribes avoided the Blackthorn crossing entirely, claiming that the area had been cursed long before the white men arrived. According to their legends, the confluence of the two great rivers was a place where the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin, and where ancient spirits demanded blood sacrifice from those who sought to pass. The tribal elders spoke of a prophecy that told of pale-skinned demons who would come from across the great water, bringing with them an ancient hunger that could never be satisfied. These demons would establish themselves at the crossing place and would feed upon the flesh of travelers until the rivers themselves rose up to reclaim the cursed ground. The prophecy also spoke of signs that would herald the arrival of these demons: strange lights in the sky, animals behaving in unnatural ways, and the appearance of plants and flowers that bloomed out of season. Many of these signs had been observed in the area around the ferry crossing in the years leading up to the Blackthorn brothers' arrival, lending credence to the tribal warnings. Despite these warnings, the steady stream of settlers, merchants, and travelers continued to use the Blackthorn ferry. The brothers' reputation for reliability and safety seemed to outweigh any concerns about local superstitions, and their crossing became an essential link in the network of trails that connected the eastern settlements with the western territories. The brothers had also cultivated relationships with local officials and influential members of the community, ensuring that any complaints or concerns about their operation would be dismissed or ignored. They made regular contributions to local churches and civic organizations, and Cain Blackthorn served on several community boards and committees that gave him advance warning of any investigations or inquiries into their activities. However, those who paid close attention began to notice disturbing patterns in the stories told by travelers who had used the ferry. Many reported that the brothers served excellent meals to passengers who were forced to wait for favorable crossing conditions, but the meat was always of an unusual flavor that they could not identify. When asked about the source of their provisions, the brothers would simply smile and speak vaguely of hunting and trading with local tribes. The meat served at the ferry crossing was indeed exceptional in both quality and flavor, leading many travelers to request the brothers' recipes or to inquire about purchasing similar provisions for their own journeys. The brothers always deflected these requests with vague explanations about family secrets and traditional preparation methods that had been passed down through generations. Some travelers reported that the meat had an almost addictive quality, leaving them craving more long after they had completed their crossing. A few individuals actually returned to the ferry crossing specifically to partake of the brothers' cooking, claiming that no other food could compare to the unique flavors they had experienced there. More troubling were the reports of travelers who had been seen approaching the Blackthorn crossing, but who never arrived at their intended destinations. In most cases, these disappearances were attributed to the many dangers of frontier travel: river accidents, wild animals, outlaws, or simply becoming lost in the vast wilderness. But the frequency of such incidents in the vicinity of the ferry began to attract the attention of those who made their living tracking missing persons. The pattern of disappearances was particularly disturbing when examined in detail. The missing travelers were almost always individuals who were traveling alone or in small groups, who carried significant amounts of money or valuable goods, and who had no immediate family or business associates who would quickly notice their absence. It was as if the brothers possessed an uncanny ability to identify the most vulnerable and isolated travelers. Professional bounty hunters and private investigators, who specialized in finding missing persons, began to notice that their trails frequently went cold in the vicinity of the Blackthorn crossing. Witnesses who had seen the missing individuals approaching the ferry would suddenly become vague and uncertain about their recollections, and physical evidence would mysteriously disappear or become contaminated beyond usefulness. The first serious investigation into the Blackthorn operation began in 1878, when a federal marshal named James Harrison was assigned to look into the disappearance of a wealthy merchant named Theodore Ashford. Ashford had been traveling with a substantial amount of gold and had been seen approaching the ferry crossing, but had never arrived at his destination in St. Louis. Marshal Harrison was an experienced investigator who had spent years tracking criminals across the frontier territories. He approached the Blackthorn crossing with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most successful lawmen in the region, but what he found there challenged everything he thought he knew about criminal behavior. Harrison's investigation began with a careful examination of the area around the ferry crossing, looking for any physical evidence that might indicate what had happened to Theodore Ashford. He found several items that appeared to belong to the missing merchant: a distinctive brass button from his coat, a piece of leather that matched his saddlebags, and, most significantly, traces of blood on the dock that appeared to be relatively fresh. The brothers were cooperative and seemingly helpful, providing detailed accounts of the travelers they had ferried across the river in recent weeks. Their records appeared to be meticulously maintained, with careful notations of passenger names, destinations, and crossing fees. According to their logs, Theodore Ashford had never used their ferry service. However, Harrison's trained eye noticed several inconsistencies in the brothers' story. The ferry boat showed signs of recent heavy use that was not reflected in their passenger logs, and he discovered personal items hidden around the property that clearly belonged to travelers who were not listed in the official records. Most significantly, he found traces of what appeared to be human blood in the cabin's kitchen area. The kitchen area was particularly suspicious, as it contained equipment and facilities that seemed far more extensive than would be necessary for preparing meals for the occasional stranded traveler. Harrison discovered large cutting tables, an unusually extensive collection of knives and cleavers, and storage areas that appeared to be designed for preserving large quantities of meat. When Harrison confronted the brothers with this evidence, their demeanor changed dramatically. The facade of helpful cooperation vanished, replaced by a cold hostility that made the marshal's skin crawl. Cain Blackthorn fixed him with a stare that seemed to look directly into his soul, and spoke in a voice that carried undertones of barely controlled menace. "Marshal Harrison," Cain said, his Scottish accent becoming more pronounced, "you are treading on ground that has been sacred to my family for longer than your civilization has existed. I would advise you to complete your investigation quickly and depart this place before the sun sets. There are things that walk these shores after dark that do not distinguish between lawmen and common travelers." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that Harrison found himself genuinely unnerved. He had faced down-armed desperados and violent criminals throughout his career, but something about Cain Blackthorn's manner suggested that he was dealing with a fundamentally different type of danger. Harrison was not a man easily intimidated, but something in Cain's tone and the way his brothers flanked him with predatory alertness made the marshal decide that discretion was the better part of valor. He left the crossing that afternoon, but not before making careful notes of everything he had observed and collecting samples of the suspicious stains he had discovered. During his journey back to civilization, Harrison experienced a series of disturbing incidents that seemed designed to discourage him from pursuing his investigation. His horse became spooked and nearly threw him into a ravine. His supplies mysteriously spoiled overnight despite being properly stored, and he repeatedly heard voices calling his name from the darkness beyond his campfire. The analysis of those samples, conducted by a physician in St. Louis, confirmed Harrison's worst suspicions. The stains were indeed human blood, and they were fresh enough to suggest that someone had been killed or seriously injured at the ferry crossing within the past few weeks. Armed with this evidence, Harrison returned to the crossing with a warrant and a team of deputies prepared to arrest the Blackthorn brothers and search their property thoroughly. But when the law enforcement team arrived at the ferry crossing, they found it completely abandoned. The brothers had vanished, taking with them their boat and most of their possessions. The cabin remained, but it had been thoroughly cleaned and showed no trace of the evidence that Harrison had discovered during his previous visit. The search of the property revealed a series of underground chambers beneath the cabin that had been carefully concealed from casual observation. These chambers contained evidence of activities that went far beyond simple murder and robbery. The walls were covered with symbols and inscriptions that appeared to be written in a language that none of the investigators could identify. The floors were stained with what appeared to be blood, and the air carried a smell of decay that suggested the chambers had been used for their grisly purpose for many years. The underground complex was far more extensive than the investigators had initially realized. A network of tunnels connected multiple chambers, each of which seemed to serve a specific purpose in the brothers' cannibalistic enterprise. One chamber contained what appeared to be an altar surrounded by carved symbols and ritual implements. Another served as a storage area for human remains in various stages of processing and preservation. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of a collection of human bones that had been arranged in complex patterns throughout the underground chambers. The bones showed clear evidence of having been systematically stripped of flesh, and many bore marks that suggested they had been gnawed by human teeth. The arrangement of the bones followed no pattern that the investigators could understand, but local Native American guides who were brought in to examine the site immediately recognized the symbols as being related to ancient cannibalistic rituals. The bone arrangements were incredibly intricate, incorporating elements that seemed to draw from multiple ancient traditions. Some patterns resembled Celtic knotwork, while others appeared to be based on Native American spiritual symbols. The complexity and precision of these arrangements suggested that they had been created by individuals with extensive knowledge of ancient religious and magical practices. The investigation also uncovered evidence that the Blackthorn brothers had been operating their cannibalistic enterprise for far longer than anyone had suspected. Hidden caches throughout the property contained personal effects belonging to dozens of travelers who had disappeared over the years, along with detailed records that the brothers had kept of their victims. These records, written in the same unknown language as the wall inscriptions, were eventually translated by a scholar of ancient Celtic languages who identified them as being written in a dialect of Gaelic that had not been spoken for over 1,000 years. The translations revealed a systematic approach to selecting and preparing victims that was both methodical and ritualistic in nature. According to the records, the brothers did not simply kill and consume their victims out of hunger or greed. Instead, they were following a complex set of ancient rituals that they believed were necessary to maintain their family's supernatural powers and to appease the dark forces that they served. The cannibalistic practices were part of a hereditary curse that had been passed down through their bloodline for countless generations. The ritual records were incredibly detailed, describing specific procedures for different types of victims and different phases of the lunar cycle. Young victims were to be consumed during the new moon to ensure fertility and renewal, while older victims were reserved for the full moon ceremonies that were believed to grant wisdom and power. The records also specified which parts of the body were to be consumed by which family members, and in what order the consumption was to take place. The curse, as described in the family records, had originated in the mists of prehistoric Scotland, when their ancestors had made a pact with entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. In exchange for power and longevity, the family had agreed to serve as instruments of these dark forces, feeding them through ritualistic consumption of human flesh and blood. Each generation of the family was bound by this ancient covenant, compelled to continue the cannibalistic practices or face consequences that were described in terms so horrific that even the hardened investigators found them difficult to read. The records suggested that family members who attempted to break free from the curse suffered fates far worse than death, becoming something that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. The family history contained in these records painted a picture of centuries of horror stretching back to the earliest days of human civilization. The Blackthorn bloodline had supposedly served their dark masters through the rise and fall of empires, adapting their methods to changing times, but never abandoning their fundamental purpose. The manhunt for the Blackthorn brothers became one of the most extensive law enforcement operations in the history of the Missouri Territory. Federal marshals, state militia, and local posses scoured the region for months, following leads and investigating reports of suspicious activities. Rewards were offered for information leading to their capture, and their descriptions were circulated throughout the frontier territories. Despite these efforts, the brothers seemed to have vanished as completely as if they had never existed. There were occasional reports of sightings in remote areas along the river systems, but none of these leads resulted in captures or confirmed identifications. The brothers' knowledge of the waterways and their apparent supernatural abilities made them extremely difficult to track. The search efforts were hampered by a series of strange incidents that seemed designed to discourage the investigators. Equipment would malfunction at crucial moments, witnesses would suddenly become unable to remember important details, and search parties would find themselves becoming lost in areas they knew well. Several investigators reported experiencing nightmares and hallucinations that seemed to be connected to their involvement in the case. However, the investigation did reveal that the Blackthorn operation had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Evidence was discovered linking them to a network of similar operations throughout the river systems of the American frontier, suggesting that they were part of a larger organization of individuals or families engaged in ritualistic cannibalism. The network appeared to operate through a complex system of communication and coordination, with different groups specializing in various aspects of the cannibalistic enterprise. Some focused on identifying and luring victims, while others were responsible for the actual killing and processing of human flesh. The Blackthorns seem to have served as a central hub for this network, coordinating activities and maintaining communication between the various participants. The communication system used by the network was based on a combination of coded messages, symbolic markings, and what appeared to be supernatural means of transmitting information across great distances. Investigators found evidence of messages that had been delivered to remote locations far faster than would have been possible using conventional means of transportation. The discovery of this network led to a broader investigation that uncovered evidence of cannibalistic activities in remote locations throughout the American West. Several other families and individuals were arrested and prosecuted for their participation in these practices, though most claimed that they had been compelled to participate by supernatural forces beyond their control. The network's reach extended far beyond what investigators had initially suspected. Evidence was found linking cannibalistic activities in locations as diverse as the California goldfields, the Texas frontier, and the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest. The scope of the operation suggested that it had been in existence for decades, if not centuries, and that it represented a hidden aspect of American frontier life that had previously gone undetected. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the unprecedented nature of the crimes and the apparent supernatural elements involved. The territorial court struggled with questions about how to prosecute cases that seemed to involve not just criminal behavior, but also elements that existed outside the normal framework of legal understanding. The few individuals who were captured and brought to trial faced charges including murder, conspiracy, and desecration of human remains. However, the trials were marked by bizarre incidents that seemed to support the defendants' claims about supernatural compulsion. Witnesses reported strange phenomena in the courtrooms, including unexplained sounds, sudden temperature changes, and the appearance of shadowy figures that could not be explained by normal means. Several of the defendants died under mysterious circumstances while awaiting trial, and others simply vanished from supposedly secure jail cells without any explanation of how they had escaped. These incidents contributed to a growing belief among both law enforcement officials and the general public that the Blackthorn case involved forces that were beyond normal human understanding. The courtroom incidents were particularly disturbing to those who witnessed them. During one trial, the temperature in the courtroom suddenly dropped to near freezing, causing witnesses and jury members to see their breath despite the fact that it was a warm summer day. During another proceeding, several people reported seeing shadowy figures moving along the walls, and one witness claimed that she heard voices speaking in an unknown language coming from empty areas of the courtroom. The impact of the Blackthorn investigation extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. The revelation that organized cannibalistic networks had been operating throughout the frontier territories shocked the American public and led to demands for increased law enforcement presence in remote areas. The case also contributed to growing concerns about the influence of supernatural forces on criminal behavior. Religious leaders throughout the region began to speak out about the dangers of occult practices and the need for spiritual vigilance against dark forces. Many churches organized special prayer services and exorcism rituals designed to cleanse areas that were believed to have been contaminated by the Blackthorn activities. The Catholic Church was particularly active in responding to the Blackthorn case, sending teams of priests trained in exorcism and spiritual warfare to investigate and cleanse sites that were believed to have been used for cannibalistic rituals. These efforts were met with mixed results, as several of the priests reported experiencing supernatural attacks and manifestations that seemed designed to drive them away from their work. The scientific community was divided in its response to the case. Some researchers dismissed the supernatural elements as superstition and folklore, arguing that the cannibalistic practices could be explained through conventional psychological and sociological theories. Others, however, began to investigate the possibility that there might be genuine supernatural forces at work in the world. Dr. Ezra Blackwood, a professor of anthropology at Harvard University, conducted an extensive study of the Blackthorn case and similar incidents throughout history. His research led him to conclude that certain families and bloodlines might indeed be subject to hereditary curses that compelled them to engage in cannibalistic practices as part of ancient religious or magical traditions. According to Blackwood's theory, these curses represented a form of spiritual parasitism in which supernatural entities used human families as hosts to maintain their presence in the physical world. The cannibalistic rituals served as a form of feeding mechanism, providing the entities with the life force they needed to continue their existence. Blackwood's research was initially dismissed by his academic colleagues as unscientific speculation, but the mounting evidence from the Blackthorn case and similar incidents gradually forced the scholarly community to take his theories more seriously. His work contributed to the development of new fields of study that attempted to bridge the gap between scientific investigation and supernatural phenomena. The professor's research also revealed that similar cases had been documented throughout history in various parts of the world. Ancient Roman historians had written about Celtic tribes that practiced ritual cannibalism as part of their religious ceremonies, and medieval chronicles contained accounts of families that were believed to be cursed with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The search for the Blackthorn brothers continued for several years, but gradually diminished as other priorities claimed the attention of law enforcement agencies. By 1895, the active manhunt had been largely abandoned, though the brothers remained on wanted lists and occasional investigations were conducted when new information became available. Over the years, there were numerous reported sightings of the brothers in various locations throughout the American West and beyond. Some of these reports were undoubtedly cases of mistaken identity, but others seemed credible enough to warrant investigation. The brothers' apparent ability to avoid capture for such extended periods suggested that they possessed resources and capabilities that went beyond those of ordinary criminals. In 1901, a steamboat captain named William Thornton reported encountering 3 men who matched the descriptions of the Blackthorn brothers on a remote stretch of the Mississippi River. According to Thornton's account, the men had flagged down his vessel and requested passage to New Orleans, paying their fare with gold coins that appeared to be of ancient origin. During the journey, Thornton became increasingly uncomfortable with his passengers' behavior. They spoke to each other in a language he could not identify, and they seemed to possess an uncanny knowledge of river conditions and navigation that exceeded his own considerable experience. Most disturbing of all, they showed an intense interest in the other passengers, studying them with the same predatory attention that had been reported by travelers who had used the Blackthorn ferry. The 3 men also displayed physical abilities that seemed to exceed normal human limitations. Thornton observed them moving cargo that should have required multiple men to lift, and they seemed to be completely unaffected by the extreme heat and humidity that left other passengers exhausted and uncomfortable. When the steamboat reached New Orleans, the 3 men disembarked and vanished into the crowded streets of the port city. Thornton immediately reported the incident to local authorities, but by the time investigators arrived at the dock, there was no trace of the mysterious passengers. The gold coins they had used to pay their fare were examined by experts who determined that they were of Celtic origin and appeared to be over 1,000 years old. The New Orleans incident sparked renewed interest in the Blackthorn case and led to a new wave of investigations throughout the southern states. However, these efforts proved no more successful than previous attempts to locate the brothers, and gradually the case once again faded from active attention. The investigation in New Orleans did reveal some disturbing information about the brothers' possible activities in the region. Several unexplained disappearances in the area around the time of their visit seemed to match the pattern of their previous crimes, and local voodoo practitioners reported sensing the presence of powerful dark forces that they associated with ancient European magic. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Blackthorn case had become firmly established as one of the most mysterious and disturbing criminal cases in American history. The combination of systematic cannibalism, apparent supernatural elements, and the brothers' successful evasion of justice had created a legend that continued to fascinate and terrify those who heard the story. The case had also contributed to significant changes in law enforcement practices and legal procedures. The brothers' ability to operate undetected for so many years had highlighted the need for better communication and coordination between different jurisdictions, leading to the development of new protocols for tracking criminals across large geographic areas. More importantly, the Blackthorn case had forced American society to confront the possibility that there might be forms of evil that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. The apparent supernatural elements of the case challenged conventional assumptions about the nature of criminal behavior and the limits of scientific explanation. The abandoned ferry crossing became a site of both fascination and fear for travelers and curiosity seekers. Local authorities attempted to restrict access to the area, but the remote location made it difficult to prevent determined individuals from visiting the site. Many reported experiencing strange phenomena while exploring the ruins of the Blackthorn operation, including unexplained sounds, apparitions, and the sensation of being watched by unseen presences. The site became a pilgrimage destination for those interested in the supernatural and the occult. Spiritualists and mediums claimed to be able to communicate with the spirits of the brothers' victims, and several reported receiving messages warning of the brothers' continued existence and their plans to resume their cannibalistic activities. In 1905, a group of paranormal investigators from the newly formed American Society for Psychical Research conducted a detailed study of the ferry crossing site. Their investigation revealed evidence of what they described as residual psychic energy that seemed to be connected to the traumatic events that had occurred there. The investigators reported experiencing a wide range of supernatural phenomena during their stay at the site, including disembodied voices speaking in unknown languages, the appearance of shadowy figures that could not be photographed, and the manifestation of smells and sounds associated with the preparation and consumption of human flesh. Most significantly, several members of the investigation team reported having vivid dreams or visions that seemed to show them the Blackthorn brothers' cannibalistic rituals in graphic detail. These visions were remarkably consistent across different individuals, suggesting that they might represent genuine psychic impressions rather than simple imagination or suggestion. The Society's report on the Blackthorn investigation was one of the first scientific studies to document apparent supernatural phenomena associated with a criminal case. While the report was met with skepticism by many in the academic community, it contributed to growing interest in the field of paranormal investigation and helped to establish protocols for studying allegedly haunted locations. The psychical researchers also discovered evidence that the supernatural phenomena at the ferry crossing site were not random or chaotic, but seemed to follow specific patterns that corresponded to the lunar cycle and other astronomical events. The intensity of the phenomena increased during certain times of the month, particularly during the new moon and full moon phases that had been significant in the brothers' ritual calendar. The story of the Blackthorn brothers continued to evolve and spread throughout American folklore, inspiring numerous books, articles, and fictional adaptations. Writers and researchers were drawn to the case not only because of its horrific nature, but also because of the many unanswered questions that surrounded it. One of the most comprehensive studies of the case was published in 1912 by Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a criminologist who had spent several years researching the Blackthorn crimes and their historical context. Sinclair's work, titled The Blackthorn Curse, A Study in Hereditary Evil, provided detailed analysis of the evidence and offered new theories about the supernatural elements of the case. According to Sinclair's research, the Blackthorn family's cannibalistic practices were part of a much larger tradition of ritual cannibalism that had existed in various forms throughout human history. She traced the origins of these practices back to prehistoric times, when early human societies had developed complex religious and magical systems that incorporated the consumption of human flesh as a means of acquiring power and communicating with supernatural forces. Sinclair argued that the Blackthorn curse represented a survival of these ancient practices, preserved and transmitted through certain bloodlines that had maintained their connection to the old ways despite the spread of Christianity and modern civilization. According to her theory, families like the Blackthorns served as living links to humanity's prehistoric past, carrying within their genetic makeup the compulsions and abilities that had once been common among their ancestors. The implications of Sinclair's research were profound and disturbing. If her theories were correct, then there might be other families throughout the world who were subject to similar hereditary curses, compelled to engage in cannibalistic practices as part of ancient religious or magical traditions. The Blackthorn case might represent not an isolated incident of criminal behavior, but rather a glimpse into a hidden world of supernatural evil that continued to exist alongside modern civilization. Sinclair's work was initially controversial within the academic community, but it gradually gained acceptance as more evidence emerged to support her theories. Her research contributed to the development of new fields of study that attempted to understand the relationship between heredity, psychology, and supernatural phenomena. Dr. Sinclair's research also revealed connections between the Blackthorn case and similar incidents throughout history. She documented cases of cannibalistic families in medieval Europe, colonial America, and various other locations around the world, all of which seemed to share certain characteristics with the Blackthorn brothers. The search for the Blackthorn brothers entered a new phase in the early 20th century, as advances in communication and transportation technology made it easier to coordinate investigations across large geographic areas. However, these technological improvements seemed to have little effect on the brothers' ability to avoid capture, suggesting that their evasion techniques went beyond conventional methods. In 1918, during the chaos of World War I, there were reports of 3 men matching the brothers' descriptions, operating a ferry service on the Rhine River in Germany. According to these reports, the men were helping German soldiers and civilians cross the river while avoiding Allied patrols, but several individuals who used their services subsequently disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The reports were investigated by Allied intelligence services, but the investigation was hampered by the ongoing war and the difficulty of operating in enemy territory. By the time the war ended, and more thorough investigations could be conducted, the mysterious ferry operators had once again vanished without a trace. The wartime reports were particularly disturbing because they suggested that the brothers were not simply hiding from justice, but were actively continuing their cannibalistic practices in new locations. The disappearances associated with the Rhine River ferry operation followed the same pattern as those that had occurred at the original Missouri crossing, indicating that the brothers had not abandoned their supernatural mission. Similar reports continued to emerge from various locations around the world throughout the early 20th century. The brothers were allegedly sighted operating ferry services on rivers in South America, Asia, and Africa, always in remote areas where their activities would be difficult to monitor or investigate. In each case, their presence was associated with unexplained disappearances and reports of cannibalistic activities. These international sightings suggested that the Blackthorn brothers possessed resources and capabilities that went far beyond those of ordinary criminals. Their ability to establish new identities and operations in distant countries implied access to a global network of supporters or accomplices who shared their supernatural nature or were compelled to assist them through supernatural means. The global scope of the Blackthorn phenomenon also raised questions about whether the brothers were unique individuals or representatives of a larger population of supernatural entities that had infiltrated human society. Some researchers began to theorize that the brothers might be part of an ancient race of beings that had existed alongside humanity since prehistoric times, occasionally revealing themselves through acts of predation and cannibalism. As the 20th century progressed, the Blackthorn case became a subject of increasing interest among researchers studying the intersection of folklore, psychology, and criminal behavior. The case was seen as a unique example of how ancient beliefs and practices could persist in modern times, manifesting themselves through apparently supernatural criminal activities. The development of new investigative techniques and scientific methods offered the possibility of gaining new insights into the case, but the passage of time had made it increasingly difficult to gather fresh evidence. Most of the original investigators had died, and many of the physical traces of the brothers' activities had been lost or destroyed. However, the story of the Blackthorn brothers continued to influence popular culture and academic research. The case became a standard reference point for discussions about the nature of evil, the persistence of ancient beliefs in modern times, and the possibility that supernatural forces might play a role in criminal behavior. In 1955, exactly 100 years after the brothers had first established their ferry operation, a commemorative ceremony was held at the site of their former crossing. The ceremony was attended by historians, law enforcement officials, and descendants of some of the brothers' victims, who gathered to remember those who had lost their lives and to reflect on the lessons that could be learned from the case. The centennial commemoration included the installation of a memorial marker that listed the names of the known victims and provided a brief summary of the case for future visitors to the site. The ceremony also featured presentations by historians and criminologists who discussed the ongoing significance of the Blackthorn case and its influence on the development of modern investigative techniques. Dr. Robert Whitfield, a great-nephew of Reverend Marcus Whitfield, who had first discovered evidence of the brothers' crimes, spoke at the ceremony about the lasting impact of the case on his family and the importance of remembering the victims of supernatural evil. He emphasized that while the case represented a dark chapter in American history, it also demonstrated the importance of remaining vigilant against forces that sought to prey upon the innocent and vulnerable. The centennial commemoration also served as an opportunity to reflect on the broader implications of the Blackthorn case for understanding the nature of evil and the limits of human knowledge. Speakers discussed the importance of maintaining an open mind about the possibility of supernatural phenomena, while also applying rigorous scientific methods to investigate claims of paranormal activity. As the second half of the 20th century began, new technologies and investigative techniques offered fresh possibilities for understanding the Blackthorn case. Advances in forensic science, psychology, and anthropology provided new tools for analyzing the evidence and developing theories about the brothers' motivations and methods. However, these scientific advances also raised new questions about the nature of the phenomena associated with the case. The more researchers learned about the brothers' activities, the more difficult it became to explain their behavior through conventional scientific theories. The apparent supernatural elements of the case continued to resist rational explanation, forcing investigators to consider the possibility that there might be aspects of reality that lay beyond the reach of current scientific understanding. The Blackthorn case also became a subject of interest among researchers studying the psychology of belief and the role of folklore in shaping human behavior. Some scholars argued that the supernatural elements of the case were products of cultural conditioning and psychological suggestion rather than genuine paranormal phenomena. According to this theory, the brothers' cannibalistic behavior could be explained through conventional psychological mechanisms, while the apparent supernatural elements were the result of witnesses' pre-existing beliefs about curses and supernatural evil. The power of suggestion and the human tendency to interpret ambiguous events in terms of existing cultural narratives could account for many of the seemingly inexplicable aspects of the case. Other researchers, however, maintained that the evidence for genuine supernatural phenomena in the Blackthorn case was too strong to be dismissed as mere psychological projection. They pointed to the consistency of witness reports across different time periods and geographic locations, the physical evidence that could not be explained through conventional means, and the brothers' apparent abilities that seemed to exceed normal human limitations. The debate between skeptical and believing researchers continued throughout the latter half of the 20th century, contributing to the development of new methodologies for investigating allegedly supernatural phenomena. The Blackthorn case became a test case for these new approaches, with researchers attempting to apply rigorous scientific methods to the study of paranormal claims. In the 1970s, a team of investigators from the University of Missouri conducted a comprehensive re-examination of the Blackthorn case using modern forensic techniques and psychological analysis methods. Their investigation included detailed analysis of the physical evidence, psychological profiling of the brothers based on witness accounts, and extensive research into the historical and cultural context of their activities. The university team's findings were mixed and controversial. While they were able to confirm many of the basic facts of the case and provide new insights into the brothers' methods and motivations, they were unable to reach definitive conclusions about the supernatural elements of the story. Some team members remained convinced that the case involved genuine paranormal phenomena, while others maintained that all of the evidence could be explained through conventional means. The university investigation did, however, contribute to a better understanding of the psychological and social factors that might have contributed to the brothers' behavior. The researchers identified several key elements that seemed to be common among individuals and families who engaged in ritualistic cannibalism, including social isolation, adherence to ancient belief systems, and psychological disorders that might predispose individuals to violent and antisocial behavior. The investigation also revealed new information about the historical context of the Blackthorn case, including evidence of similar cannibalistic activities in other parts of the world during the same time period. This evidence suggested that the brothers might have been part of a larger phenomenon of ritualistic cannibalism that was occurring in various isolated communities throughout the world during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Blackthorn case remained one of the most mysterious and controversial criminal cases in American history. The combination of systematic cannibalism, apparent supernatural elements, and the brothers' successful evasion of justice had created a legend that continued to fascinate researchers and the general public alike. The case had also contributed to significant advances in the fields of criminal investigation, forensic science, and paranormal research. The methods developed for studying the Blackthorn case had been applied to numerous other investigations, helping to establish new standards for the scientific study of allegedly supernatural phenomena. Perhaps most importantly, the Blackthorn case had forced American society to confront fundamental questions about the nature of evil and the limits of human understanding. The case challenged conventional assumptions about criminal behavior and raised the possibility that there might be forms of evil that existed beyond the normal boundaries of scientific explanation. The story of the Blackthorn brothers serves as a reminder that there are still mysteries in the world that resist easy explanation, and that the boundary between the natural and supernatural may not be as clear as we would like to believe. Whether the brothers were simply criminals who used superstition and fear to enhance their predatory activities, or whether they were genuine supernatural entities bound by ancient curses, their story continues to challenge our understanding of the nature of evil and the limits of human knowledge. The legacy of the Blackthorn case continues to influence contemporary discussions about crime, justice, and the supernatural. As new technologies and investigative techniques are developed, researchers continue to hope that they might finally be able to solve the mystery of the brothers' true nature and ultimate fate. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Blackthorn case is not about the brothers themselves, but about the victims whose lives were cut short by their predatory activities. The merchants, settlers, and travelers who disappeared at the ferry crossing were individuals with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them. Their stories serve as a reminder of the human cost of evil, whether natural or supernatural, and of the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would prey upon the innocent and vulnerable. The curse of the Blackthorn brothers may never be fully understood or broken, but their victims will not be forgotten. Their memory serves as a warning to future generations about the dangers that can lurk in the shadows of civilization, and as a testament to the importance of courage, justice, and the fundamental human obligation to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. In the end, the macabre history of the curse of the Blackthorn brothers who turned travelers into supper remains one of the most disturbing and mysterious cases in the annals of American crime. Whether driven by ancient curses or modern madness, their story serves as a dark reminder that evil can take many forms, and that the price of safety and civilization is eternal vigilance against the forces that would drag us back into the darkness from which we came.